I'm Madam Strom. I have the honor to moderate this conversation. I'm a sucker for stories, right? It's what brings me into the world. It's what engages me. So thank you all so much, and I love the variety of medium. So I want to start with you, Emily, because one of the things that when you and I were doing the exercise and when you were talking, one of the things that came up again and again is this question of trauma. And are we re-traumatizing kids? So I'd love to ask you a little bit about that. Are we re-traumatizing kids? And while you're thinking about that, there's a second question I want you to grapple with, because I think because of your story and your identity, you have an experience that you bring into the classroom when you're doing this. But what about the folks who don't have your story? And what advice might you give, again, with the concern that you heard some people saying about re-traumatizing folks?
Yeah, I guess we do have to be very careful about it. I don't ever push my students to put them against the wall to, hey, tell me your story. Because personally, I even have things that I have never shared with anyone because I just feel like it just belongs to me and not to the world to know. So yes, there are things that you don't want to say, but at the same time, there's a fine line between some things that need to be told because it builds your identity. So the experiences when you come as an immigrant, whatever happened to you in the immigration process and what builds your identity and who you are, it's important to share it, whether it's maybe with a friend or with a teacher, or if you want it to be public to the world. I think it's a process that needs to be told. And I see it as a healing process, because I felt like when I was keeping my story to myself, I just kept it, and it kept hurting me more, knowing that I have gone through all of this and, oh, poor me, versus, hey, this empowers me, versus making me feel bad about it. Now, I have students who are refugees. I don't have that experience, but I have literature that represents that experience. So one example I have is this student that came over who was a refugee. I couldn't sit down and say, I understand you, because I really didn't or don't. But I have this book by Alan Gratz, and it talks about 3 refugee students. Read it. It was so empowering for him to read it. His dad ended up reading it as well. So here you go, as teachers or adults around students, if we don't know or have not experienced those lives, then find literature that represents those and use them as windows and mirrors for your students.
Thanks, Emily. I think that's really, really important. I mean, one of the things that we do often before we do the activity that you and I did, we actually like to have a conversation intentionally about sharing. And how do you decide what you want to share? So people think about those questions, because obviously there are legal issues that can come up. There are all kinds of psychological, so let's have people be thoughtful about that. So
I think I would add to that, Adam, that I think it's really important to present respect as one of the early learning lessons in terms of how to tell stories, is teaching about how do you respect others, how do you make sure you create a relationship before you start asking for their story. Especially if you're going out from outside of your close network, to really understand what it takes to establish a relationship before you start asking for story.
Actually, so let me stay with you for a second, Michael, because I'm thinking a little bit about that, right? Is what might you suggest are some ground rules, like for folks who haven't actually, I mean, I know some of this you've written in the guide, but if you were to say, like, there are 2 or 3 things that everybody should be thinking about, I mean, especially when that activity, which I just love, is videotaping somebody's kind of a cultural activity that may be outside of your own experience. What do you suggest would be a couple of ground rules for going about that?
Okay, so it's really important to think about how you're going to help people understand about crossing boundaries and opening up spaces. First off, I noticed there's quite a few comments about that fear of re-traumatizing, et cetera. And one issue is to make sure, I think, you know, there is a power relationship, right? There's a power relationship between myself and the trainees, so to speak, right? But the trainees have an equality between them, or the students have equality between them. If I ask them something about their story, they may feel a different kind of pressure to present that than if they ask each other, or if they go into their own communities and ask. And that's one of the reasons, of course, community supported film exists, is to strengthen that possibility of people asking within rather than from outside to within. And of course, in the process of just doing the project of then documenting, et cetera, there is a lot of listening that has to happen, right? Your job as a gatherer is to learn, and part of the teaching process in advance is to be aware of how you need to not direct. We have too much of an idea of directing in storytelling and filmmaking, but to listen and be receptive and be available, especially in the more documentary realm, right? And then also to be very aware that maybe you do need to stop. Maybe there is a point in which people aren't comfortable anymore, and you have to be ready and accepting of that. But the one thing I would say just about the exercise to really pay attention to is to try and emphasize the experience over the talk. We have so much talk, so much interview-driven material in filmmaking, and the experience is what kind of allows people to see into and allows people to start to find parallels that they can actually experience.
Thanks, Michael. So Jake, let me use that as kind of as a bridge into you, because you're talking about, you think of yourself as a storyteller, and you do it very, very respectfully, right? I mean, it's very clear when you look at what you've done, that you're listening carefully, you're listening sensitively, and it's also clear that how people respond to your attempt to tell their story matters to you as well, and I think that's really powerful.
Thank you.
And yet we're in the middle of this conversation right now nationally about who has the right to tell whose story. So help us think about sort of the ethics of that.
It's really complicated. It's a really important question, and I'm glad you asked it. So I've got kind of two answers for you. First, I just want to explain how I did it with the family that I wrote about. So my concern right off the bat was that I didn't want them to feel like they had to participate in my story, right? I wanted it to be as close to consensual as it could be. So when I met them when they landed, I said, hey, you know, basically like, I'm Jake, you know, this is my illustrator, Michael, we're gonna circle back. And the understanding that I had was, I wanted to go back and meet them without any of their co-sponsors there, without any of the people from the refugee resettlement agencies. So they understood that as best as possible, that participating and talking to me was in no way connected to or conditional whatever support they would get. And I went to them that first time very much thinking to myself, there's a good chance that they're gonna be on the fence and I'm just gonna walk away. And so I went there, and it turns out the family was very keen to tell their story, but I still wasn't convinced that they were on board or understood what they're getting into. So we did the first sketch, which was like 24 panels, Michael and I did. And there's a rule in journalism, you're never supposed to show your copy to your subject. It's just meant to be like a firewall so that, you know, you have that separation. And I decided to hell with that. Like they need to understand what this is going on here. And so I laid out a pencil sketch of the 24 panels that would go in the Times. I had Mohammed with me, Mohammed Kadala, my wonderful translator, and I said, talk them through, please, every single panel. So they talked, and I was kind of nervous. I had put in a few months of work. I hadn't been paid, you know. I was ready to walk, but I didn't want to. And he got to the end, and Issa, the dad, looked at me and said, the car that took us to the airport in Jordan was a 2011 Mitsubishi Lancer. That is not a 2011 Mitsubishi Lancer. And I said, is that it? And Mohammed said, yeah, that's it. And I went like this. But that act of kind of checking back in with them constantly, daily, it was ongoing. Like I remember the dad called me at one time and said, Jake, I've got no internet. can you come over here and take me to Comcast and help me deal with this? Again, the rule of the journalist in that situation is that I shouldn't do that, that it's a firewall, that there shouldn't be a quid pro quo. You're participating with me. And I, again, had this weird gray moment and I said, to hell with it. They don't have internet. They don't know anyone with a car. I'm just gonna, like, my gut is to just take them and do this. And I went and I did it, and it was almost embarrassing. Every time I went over to the house, they'd be like, we have internet thanks to you, you know? I was like, enough. But this went back and forth. And it even went down to the very end when I couldn't give them money. And they got a death threat at one point. And they said, will you call the head of the refugee resettlement agency and push him to move us? And I said, I can't do that. But here's what I will do. I will call him up and I will ask him what he's doing about this. And me and the dad looked at each other, and he's a smart guy, and he understood that that was a question I was allowed to ask, but that would also put some, you know, heat on them. So we were in this dance constantly. When I won the prize, because we won the Pulitzer Prize, I didn't hesitate. I split the money evenly between me and the other two families. But this was, and the last time, I'm sorry to go on so long, but there's one other story, and I think it's really important. If I'll say nothing else, I want to share this. I went to this event in New York after we won the Pulitzer, and this young man stood up in front of the audience, and he asked a version of the question you did. He basically said, hey, you white guy, you know, you won the Pulitzer Prize.
That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. I mean, he said, what has the family gotten out of this, right? And it was a heated moment because people are passionate about that, and I respect that. And people were like clicking their hands like this. It felt like middle school right before a fight breaks out, you know? And I said, I want to start by saying thank you for the question, and I want to let you know that your doubts were my doubts every single day that I worked on this project. And the only way that I could tell this story was by accepting those doubts and proceeding with humility that this was not my experience. And I was fundamentally, in many ways, clueless. And that humility, we hope, would maybe somehow translate into a better job at reporting. But I said one other point, and I do believe this, because there is a long history of appropriation of white dudes like me stealing disenfranchised, and that's real, and that has to be respected and addressed. But I do believe on a broader scale that we should still have a world in which one person can help tell the story of another person, even if that person is different from them. Because if I could only tell the story of guys like me, I would only be able to tell stories of middle-aged Jewish guys from Buffalo. And the only other dude I know is my brother. That's a small box, right? So I think it's this weird balancing act where on the one hand, you have to accept as real and with respect this idea of appropriation, but you also have to hold on to this hope that we as human beings, if with humility and with a certain amount of awareness, are capable of building bonds and telling each other's stories, even sometimes when we come from different places. So I'm sorry I went on way too long, but it's a great question, and it's the one thing I would
and your answer is powerful. I mean, I think there is a reminder, right? So with privilege and opportunity, we have an obligation to amplify the stories that would not get told otherwise. At least I feel that way. I also heard just two things that I want to pull out. I heard a real ethic of humility, and I heard an ethic of care. And I think that's really, really important. So one thing I guess I want to ask all of you, and this is in relationship to what does it mean to be sharing our stories across each other? Or, you know, even if we're talking about all the immigrant kids, right? You know, what advice would you give people? Do you think it's too much of a lift? I'm kind of playing with an idea here. You think it's too much of a lift to ask people to be responsible for telling each other's story in a class? And if you did something like that, what would you want to make sure was set up in advance?
Well, you know what? Today, I would say I wouldn't wait to be invited to tell the story. I think today we are, especially like when I say today, 2020 is a time where stories need to be heard. And if I'm going to be waiting for somebody to sit down and have a cup of coffee with me to hear my story, that may never happen because some people may not want to hear it. But if I take the initiative to start sharing the story so I can find someone, so we can find similarities and differences, I think that's powerful. And we can empower students by taking this ownership, by having them advocate for themselves. So when students begin to feel that they belong in a classroom, in a school, in a community, they know they have a voice. You don't have to give them a voice. They already have it. All we have to do is provide those platforms for them to be able to tell their stories.
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of playing with that connection, right? Somebody's told a story. I mean, and so some classes we've worked with have taken the exercise, Emily, that you and I did, where they've interviewed each other. And then then what happens is the teacher then asks the interviewer to tell that other kid's story, to do it with care and ethics and respect, but to do that. So in some ways, Michael, that's sort of a bit of what filmmakers do. So what do you think?
Well, I also think I think it's really important to think about, and we emphasize the idea of actually not trying to tell your own story, and of not trying within a class of telling each other's story, because there's a lot of traps one can fall into there where people will become uncomfortable, or some people will dominate. But if you go outside that environment, at least at the beginning, I totally believe that you can come back to your own story. But if you go outside that environment to start with and find stories as a process of researching and learning, and then try and tell those stories and bring those back, you start in a way on a more even level in the classroom without sort of setting up some relationship that can be challenging in the classroom, which is important sooner or later, but not necessarily an immediate place to start.
It's interesting. You start to get a context, right? What do you know about the context? So Jake, this comes back to you. How important was it for you to understand the broader context before you started to tell that individual family story?
I think you have to understand a bit of the broader context. And I remember thinking, back to the bit about humility. I remember when I embarked on this, as a journalist, we often parachute into these worlds that we know not that much about. I always joke, my wife is a medical school professor of endocrinology. She has like incredible specific knowledge. And I feel like the opposite. I feel like woefully uninformed every time I start a project. And I think that that's the first thing, is to admit to yourself, you don't know very much. And so trying to kind of understand, okay, there was a drought in Syria, and then coupled with the drought, there was corruption, and the drought and the corruption together, and then the Arab Spring creates these protests in the street. And so you can kind of have a sense of some of the bigger tectonic factors that are at play, because there's always the small narrative and the big narrative. And to be honest with you, the small narrative comes better to me because I'm a people person. The big narrative is always harder and more complicated. And what I'll often do is I'll just call someone up who knows it better than me, and I'll just say, here's what I think it is. Am I right? Am I wrong? Okay. And if they say you're totally wrong, being not being defensive about it, just being thank you. Help me understand how I'm wrong, because I'd rather be wrong in front of you than wrong in front of everyone else. So absolutely, you've got to find a way to educate yourself and to admit what you don't know.
I think that's great. And what I so appreciated about this collection of wonderful people is that we're inside and outside of these experiences of storytelling, right? So Emily, you're talking about your own story, but also using that as an agency. It's not really the right word, but using it as an instigator for your student story. And Michael, thinking about how do you empower folks to tell their own story using a tool that may help them build a larger audience. At least that's part of what you're doing. I hate to reduce anybody's work here. And then Jake, not only as a journalist, but also thinking very carefully about just the form of journalism here, right? I think it's a very interesting choice to use a graphic novel, a graphic storytelling approach as a way in. So I really appreciate all of you coming at this from very different angles. So if you were to, I'd love it if, in some ways, to call out a little bit of promotion. So Emily, one thing that you're involved in or you've created that you think that people could take away and use it in their work to promote this?
I use an app, and it's a website called Right Reader. That's just rightreader.com, and is a way for students to electronically log their stories. They can add pictures to it. I made my own, and I have students do that themselves. I've had elementary students do it, high school students do it. I even had colleagues do it too. So this online platform is amazing, because once students begin to finish typing their story, you can print it out, you can share it online, you can text it, you can email it. I mean, it's sorts of platforms that you can share this story. So it is rightreader.com.
Fabulous. And then somebody I know, Miss Francis, is creating a podcast that is actually one episode in. You were supposed to remember that you're supposed to tell people about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just started. So I hate to be making a big fuss about this, because I only have one episode. But my intentions behind this is, because I work with high school students and looking for ways for them to be inspired, is just it's my story, just like you heard it today. It's just the voice telling my narrative, immigrant narrative. And I just want students to hear it and be able to say, hey, I lived that. I have that same experience. And just yesterday, I received a message from a colleague from I want to say she's from Kentucky. She's from Kentucky. She's teaching at a summer class right now. And she had her students hear that first episode, and she emailed me their feedback. And I was bawling. I was just so honored that I was able to connect with kids that I haven't even met just through this podcast. One episode.
So Jake, I know somebody has a book coming out.
Yeah. All right, if you twist my arm, I will. Yeah, so this was what I was mentioning earlier. The series that we ran in the New York Times, it was called Welcome to the New World. That series ran for about a year, the family's first year in the United States, and starting in 2016 at the election. And what we did, me and my illustrators, we followed the family around for almost 4 years. And we actually mainly profiled the two teenage kids. And I got to know them really well. As their English, I mean, as I think Emily would appreciate this, as their English got better and better, they felt more and more empowered to tell me their story. And because I didn't speak Arabic, I had to kind of wait for that. But when they did, I realized that their story was kind of the most incredible story, because they were the ones that were pushing to come here. And then when the death threat occurred, the family kind of turned, particularly on the teenage son, and said, "Are you happy? This is the great America you were talking about." And so the book follows the kind of odyssey of these two kids, these two teenagers, and it's in graphic narrative format. And I would just say again, we'll send out an email after this, and you all can get free digital copies of the book, and use the Immigration Learning Center's teaching guide to teach it in your classrooms. So. And also, I'll be doing some virtual visits in the fall, and I don't know how many, they'll be limited, but the ones I do, I don't intend to charge anything. I'll do them for free. I don't know I can do every one, but again, all that at your disposal, hopefully.
Fabulous. And then just Michael?
Yeah, and I just want to add one point that I think is really important to all three of these perspectives, which is that, storytelling, especially experiential storytelling like we witnessed here, is really a great platform for expanding minds around history and culture, and about abuse and about politics, frankly, education around policy. And each of the films that's made, even if it seems like a very simple story about very specific things, is an avenue to open up discussion about broader issues. And if people are doing exercises around that kind of thing, they should be being asked to expand the conversation beyond taking the specific to the universal is an excellent way to bring people into the important topics that need action. But again, NIRV, New Immigrants and Refugee Visions, is available, and we would love to have you use it.
What an honor for me to be in conversation with such eloquent people. Thank you, Denzel, for letting me do this.
Thank you.
But stick around. We just have a couple of questions from attendees before we move on to our next module. And maybe Mike, you might want to chime in here. Valen wants to know about, is it better to uphold and support documentarians who may not have the platforms and outreach to tell those stories as opposed to white people telling these stories?
Yeah, well, of course, this is a very complicated and important issue. And frankly, our motto is, with all respect to Jake, our motto is take the foreign out of the foreign correspondent, right? Is to try and disrupt the system and understand that we need to go local. We need to start to understand people's situations from their perspective and not their situations from how we are living it, how we need to deal with it, how we, even in the NGO sector, not just in the media sector, everybody needs to be thinking about who's developing the stories and why and what kind of messaging is being communicated that's going to impact people's lives and understanding of their situation. So yes, it's really important.
And Jake and Emily, Roxana, and I think a few others wanted to know some mediums for students who are quieter or shy, if you want them to share. And I think the idea of artwork, right, Jake?
Actually, Emily, you're the teacher. You go first.
Well, oh, very good question. Okay, and I think back to what Jake said is if they're shy is because they don't know the language yet. So, you know, they can do it in home language, and you have all sorts of platforms. If they don't want their voice to be heard, they can write it. Of course, going back to the platform of blogging the story or using written work. But I mean, there's so many. I've also used Flipgrid for students to be able to tell their stories. And I mean, just writing was a great way, but I found that when students feel that sense of belonging and that you do want to hear their stories, that shyness goes away. It's just a little wall that they put up there because they don't really think that their story is important to share.
Jake, you wanted to add anything?
No, I think that Emily said it well. I will tell you one little mini story, which was that there were two teenage kids that I wrote about, and I was always taking the brother, the son out, you know, and I didn't want to ask the daughter to come too because I didn't know if there was issues with coming with a strange guy. We'd go out to a Mexican restaurant, and my wife kept on saying to me, "You got to get the girl's perspective. Like, you know, no one wants to just hear because, you know, she had a unique thing. She had the hijab and it was unique." So one day we were going out to this Mexican restaurant. She was just standing by the door, and I said, "Amal, do you want to?" "Yes," you know. And she was waiting for me to ask her, basically. And I was missing that cue for a while because I was so worried about. So I know there's a lot of comments in here about you don't want to traumatize, but you also don't want to be so kind of timid that you don't just say, "Do you want to also share?" You know? So that's all I'd add.
And I would
Thank
just
you so
add,
much.
Denzel, very quickly that, you know, the media industry, the storytelling industry is dominated by type A people. So it's really important to look to those who are quieter and who, you know, who need to be opened up.
So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your stories and your experiences and your recent work. We really, really appreciate it. Final question, Jake, really quickly, everyone wants to know if you're still in touch with the family and what's going on.
Yeah, so I am. They've had so much. They got COVID. The whole family got COVID. And they also went through their house. There was a really bad house fire and they were forced out of the house. It's just like the trial of Job, honestly. But what comes, they're doing well now. They're resituated in their house. They're through COVID. The family is incredibly resilient. And hearing actually Emily and hearing her story, I know, Emily, you're right. Yours is an immigrant story. It's different than a refugee story, but it's clear you have this really powerful incandescent resilience. And I see that very much, particularly with the kids. And the last story I'll have, and this is super helpful, super hopeful. The family was in their house and there was a house fire. And Naji, who's the 16-year-old, woke up to the flickering flame and the smoke of the house fire. And it immediately brought back, he said, the memories of Syria during the siege of Homs. And he was like, I think he suffers from this, okay? And he went out of the house and they all went out and they realized their upstairs neighbor was still in the house. And Naji, 16-year-old Naji, pulled his shirt over his face, ran back up through the smoke of this burning house, and banged on the door until the upstairs neighbor basically roused from her sleep and came down. And this woman I talked to, she said that she credited Naji with saving her life. And, you know, people say to me sometimes, isn't it depressing to write about refugees? And the answer is yes, sometimes, but definitely not always. Because every time I see that 16-year-old kid and I see his resilience and I see what he can do at 16, I think whatever I'm dealing with, whatever it is, I can get through it because I see this kid doing it. And so this family's got a lot ahead of itself, but I think that they're doing all right for now, and they're blessed with that great resilience.